Okay, I'm still waiting, so I bring out a compilation of my Tintin adventure reports for the world to hear, especially the English world.
Hello, you bloody Anglophonians, from London to LA, from Sydney to New York until the Hudson Bay. Hello, Mr. Eminem. Hello, Mrs. Queen. This is a message to you from Berlin. Normally you are not interested in us, what we sing, what we say, and what we discuss. You don't give a damn.
In 20th century Europe, comics had to go through a certain development. And one person who played a big part in this was Georges Prosper Rémy, born on May 22nd, 1907 in Etterbeek near Brussels. But you might not know him under this name, but under his pen name, Hergé. To come up with a pen name was a very easy step for Hergé. He took his initials from Georges Rémy, GR, turned them around, and spoken French, they sounded like Hergé. And then he invented a way how to write it in French. As a young man, Georges discovered that he was very talented in drawing. His personality was formed by the Boy Scouts, and a lot of the ethics of the Boy Scouts can be found in his later works. Although his parents had other plans, Georges had the wish to become a journalist, a reporter. And in fact, during the 1920s he started working at a newspaper, the Belgian The 20e Siècle, the 20th century. Maybe he thought, now I can reach the goal of my life, becoming a reporter. But his superiors found out that he had other talents. He was not a reporter, but a talented drawing artist and a storyteller. His editor-in-chief, the Catholic priest Norbert Vallée, encouraged him to draw a continuating story for the children's edition of Le 20e Siècle, called Le Petit 20e, the Small 20th. Hergé was not a reporter, but he would create one. And so the reporter Tintin, English Tintin, came into existence. His first adventure started on January 10th, 1929. It was called Tintin au Pays des Soviets, or Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. At least in short. You can see this title on the German cover on this image. But the original title was a bit longer. And interestingly, this longer title found its way on the title of the English edition of the comic book. The Adventures of Tintin, reporter for Le Petit 20e in the Land of the Soviets. When we now start talking about the story of the book, well, there's a problem, because the title is title and story in one. Hergé was entering new territory in a literal way. Number one was that comics were not that well known in Europe at the time, and number two, he on his own had a few experiences with comic books. Before that, he was drawing only short stories and episodes. Now he had to draw a story that went on for several chapters and weeks. Tintin in the Land of the Soviets is the story of Tintin and his dog Snowy traveling to Soviet Russia. There's no really concept in the story, it's just scene after scene where something happens. The scenes went from slapstick to grotesque, and Hergé had to admit later on that the whole story was tendentious. As source material about the life and living in Russia in the 1920s, he had only one book. Moscou sans voile, Moscow without a veil. All this book was trying to do was to cement the prejudices and the preconceptions that the West had about the East. The book was given to Hergé by his superior Norbert Vallée, who was a right-wing conservative. The whole story about going to Russia was also his idea. And Vallée once said this: "We are not only hostile against Jews, Freemasons and Communists. That should be clear." The newspaper, he's talking about 20th siècle, his newspaper. The newspaper is also hostile against anything that connects to money, politics or modernity in general. Hergé himself was fascinated by America and the American natives and their culture. And if he had the choice, he would send his reporter there. So you can't really criticize this special comic book other than what it is. This is a piece of history and a piece of learning for Hergé. And so it can only be recommended for true Tintin fans who want to know the origins of the character. The comic book, in contrary to other works, was never colored and never reworked. Hergé later called the book a sin of his youth. And he would have liked it if nobody ever talked about it again. It was public pressure that made him republish the book in 1973. For the later Tintin stories, he had learned, not only in his drawing style, but also how to research material for the stories. Next to the fact that there is no real story in the book, the single biggest weakness of the story was the relying on one book as source material, and this book was written as an anti-communist propaganda. Some facts in the book were true, but most of them were either blown out of proportion or simply invented by the writer. And apart from these, there was not much sense for realism in the story. For example, Tintin survives being frozen in ice. In another scene, he carves a propeller of an aeroplane out of a log. Twice, I must say, because the first one doesn't work right. To sum it up, the book is, historically seen, pretty interesting. You can see here what Middle Europeans in the 1920s were thinking about Soviet Russia. You can also follow Hergé's development, and some of the things you can even see in this book. For example, the drawings get better and more detailed the further the story goes on. And you can watch how one of Tintin's trademarks comes into existence. His quiff, or should I say cowlick? Don't know. Anyway, if you look closely on this panel from the beginning of the story, you can see that Tintin's hair is pretty straight. Later in the story, Tintin is driving very fast in an open car, and the wind pushes up his hair. And from that on, it stays right into that position. But now, when we take a closer look at the story, we find a connection to today, concerning fake news. Yes, life in Soviet Russia at these times wasn't pretty. It was a regime terrorizing the people. But is this a reason for inventing propaganda? Wouldn't it be just enough to tell the truth? And isn't it interesting that a man of the church, Abbé Norbert Vallée, is taking part in spreading the lies? Actively spreading the lies. What about this thing about the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not lie and such? For the sake of it, I just looked it up, and in the Bible there is no footnote at this commandment. There's no exception from the rule, thou shalt not lie. And if we say, hey, those others over there are lying and betraying, shouldn't we be doing it better? Hergé and the story of the Tintin books can be a role model here. Hergé made several mistakes in this book, but he didn't repeat them later on. He learned. And learning from the mistakes of the past should be possible for everybody. And to wrap this up, if you are familiar with some of Tintin's adventures, well, you should stick to one of the other books, not this one. Well, it says something that this book has never gotten its own number in the series of comic books from Tintin. It's a number 0, a number O. It's a foreword for collectors who want to complete their collection, or if you want to, you can read it as I stated before, with some actual meaning. Tintin never seems to get old or get out of fashion.
We can write a smash hit, wenn's auf Deutsch ist, kriegt das von euch keiner mit, because you don't understand German.
For the Congo, as with Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, the fact was that I was fed on the prejudices of the bourgeois society in which I moved. It was 1930. I only knew things about these countries that people said at the time. Africans were great big children, thank goodness for them, we were there, etc. And I portrayed these Africans according to such criteria, in the purely paternalistic spirit which existed then in Belgium. Hergé, in an interview years after the publishing of Tintin in the Congo. Tintin is on his way to the Congo for his newspaper. But even before his arrival on the ship he's traveling, there are incidents. And the incidents go on after he set foot on the African continent, because somebody is trying to let Tintin die in some sort of accident. The person pulling the strings behind these accidents is a well-known mobster. And besides that, Tintin and Snowy are having some other adventures in Africa. Right after he finished Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, Hergé wanted to go on with a special adventure. Tintin should go to America and fight the American gangsters. And he was supposed to fight for the rights of the American natives. But the chief editor Norbert Varlet didn't want to hear anything of those ideas, at least for the moment. There was propaganda to be done. Norbert Varlet wanted Tintin to go to the Congo, that was a Belgian colony by the time. Before it was known as Zaire, by the time it was known as Belgian Congo, and today's name is Democratic Republic of the Congo. So Hergé tried to inform himself via newspaper articles and books, but the problem was those newspaper articles and those books were of course written from a very European point of view, or a Belgian point of view, so to speak. So they were full of racial stereotypes, and of course they were praising the colonization of Africa. Later it should be a trademark of Hergé's work to be as authentic as he can be, but that state was not yet reached. And in addition to the racial stereotypes and the uncritical praising of Congo as a colony of Belgium, Hergé made several factual mistakes. For example, Tintin finds a rubber tree in the nature. A rubber tree is something that does not naturally grow in Africa. What you have to hold in Hergé's favor is that he didn't send his reporter voluntarily to Africa. And you can see that because the man behind all those incidents that happened to Tintin is one of America's greatest gangsters. So Hergé was laying a track to America and hoped he could follow that track in a later issue. That gangster, of course, is Al Capone, who wants to get his hand on diamond smuggling from Africa. The whole structure of the story is not as episodic as Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, and you can't look at it with the eyes of a European or a human altogether from today. There are some things in the story that are mostly unthinkable today, but were completely normal by the time, in the early 1930s. I've already talked about the racial stereotypes. The Africans are portrayed as big children. And in addition to that, there's the big hunt. If you had the money to travel to Africa in these times, then a big hunt or safari is of course something you would have done. From today's point of view, it might be upright barbaric, seeing Tintin killing a crocodile, 10 antelopes, a monkey, 2 snakes, an elephant, a buffalo and a rhino within the story. But in the 1930s, this was normal business. But the new thinking already took place in the 1970s, when the book was colored and partly rewritten. Especially German and Scandinavian publishers found it too hard that Tintin not only kills the rhino in one of the scenes, but he's really blowing it up with gunpowder. So Hergé did a redrawing of that scene only for Germany and Scandinavia. And in that scene, the rhino is getting away alive. And if you look closely to this picture, you can see a camera and equipment standing next to a tree. Yes, this story has one of the rare occasions where we see Tintin work in his job as a reporter. Later on he will become more of an adventurer. And we rarely see him do reporter's work. Well, but Tintin must be a pretty good reporter. Because at the beginning of this story there are representatives of different newspapers, an American, a British and a Portuguese one. And they all want to buy the story that Tintin is going to write exclusively for their own newspaper. And they do some sort of bidding, offering him more and more money. But he outright refuses due to the obligation he has with his own newspaper in Belgium. So, final thoughts. Tintin in the Congo is hardly the best adventure of Tintin. Later stories should have some sort of timelessness. You can read them over and over again and they don't age. This one has aged pretty bad. You can't look at it with the eyes of a modern man. You can only see it, like Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, as a part of history. Well, I mentioned that Hergé reworked some parts, but he could not, of course, remove all the racial stereotypes we see there. It is a nice adventure story in some parts, but if someone is worrying if he could give this special comic book to his children to read, I would say yes, under certain circumstances. And that is, talk with your children about what's going on, and that these times are gone now, and that were the thoughts that people had by that time. And if you're still uncertain if you can give it to your children, then well, there are more and far better stories to come. It's no wonder that neither Tintin in the Land of the Soviets nor Tintin in the Congo have ever been made into a movie or the episode of a cartoon series.
Among you are very few who learn a foreign language, but we do.
After Hergé bowed to the instruction of his publisher Vallée concerning the stories Tintin in the Land of the Soviets and Tintin in the Congo, he was finally able to do the story about the destination he had planned from the beginning. In 1931 he sent his reporter to the place he wanted to see, America. Tintin travels to America, more specifically to Chicago. In 1931 it's the age of prohibition and the city is firmly in the hands of gangster stars like Alphonse Scarface Al Capone. After Tintin messed up his diamond business in Africa, the gangster boss does not like that a reporter appears in his city and wants him dead. From that point on, either Tintin is chased by the gangsters or the gangsters are chased by Tintin. The journey of the reporter takes him from Chicago to the western United States, where he meets the tribe of the Blackfoot Indians. With this story, Hergé has taken one more step in his development. We can presume that is because the story was not forced onto him like the last one, but it was close to his heart. So he shows an extremely detailed and accurate view on the tribal jewelry of the Indians Tintin meets on his journey, and shows a satirical view of the greed of the white man for oil and the unrestrained capitalism. For example, within one day, American companies are building an entire city on an oil discovery in an Indian reservation, including the removing of the Indian natives by the National Guard. In this respect, one can regard his story as an antipoint to Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. For Hergé, communism and capitalism were two extremes that were dangerous to people. His personal attitude was somewhere in the middle and then very pro-European. The episodic nature in this story decreases again a bit more, and there's a threat chasing the gangster, although at a few moments the story is continued just by the fact that one of the gangsters escapes in the very last moment from the police. At some point in the story, it is no longer clear why Tintin continues the chase of the gangster, at least not for a story. In fact, Tintin is referred to be a journalist in this adventure, but what he does is hardly the job of a journalist. To the contrary, with this story, he has finally begun his second career. He is now officially an adventurer. The story is still, you can call it, a bit rough on the edges, and having a real criminal like Al Capone appear is pretty unique in the universe of Tintin. Capone appears only in the beginning of the story, and it is clear that this story does not need him. He is later replaced with the fictitious gangster boss Bobby Smiles. And it works much better because, after all, Capone was known to stay out of the dirty work of his subordinates. Unfortunately, at the end of the story, the reader is left in the dark as whether Capone is among the 355 arrested members of the Chicago gangster syndicate. In reality, of course, he wasn't. The adventures Tintin in America, in the Land of the Soviets, and in the Congo you can call something of an initial trilogy. At the end of this trilogy, Hergé has come to a point where he knows how to shape his further adventures. Yeah, but one very important step in his development is still missing, but he will do it in the work on the next adventure. Tintin in America is an exciting adventure with socio-critical comments, which, however, sometimes seem a bit naive. And here and there are still elements in the story that lack a certain sense of reality. On the other hand, there is more than one opportunity where Tintin has to rely on his wits rather than on his physical strength. The adventure was originally drawn in black and white, and when it was colored, Hergé changed certain things. Interestingly, some of these changes were made because American publishers didn't want to see black people or Asians in the story.
And I bet in the end you will regret that we take the English language and we squeeze it until...
In 1932, Hergé began working on a longer adventure, first titled Aventure de Tintin, Reporter en Extrême-Orient. Translated, The Adventures of Tintin, Reporter in the Far East. For the release as an album, the story was split into two parts, Cigars of the Pharaoh and the Blue Lotus. This could be done very well, since the stories build on each other, but one story arc was completed with the end of Cigars of the Pharaoh. After the past adventures, Tintin enjoys some vacation in the form of a Mediterranean cruise. On the ship he meets Egyptologist Sophocles Sarcophagus, who is looking for the tomb of the pharaoh Kiosk. The Egyptologist invites Tintin to be his companion on the search. However, before the ship arrives in Port Said, Tintin is arrested for drug smuggling. Someone, a shady figure, tries to get him out of the way. Tintin escapes and accompanies Professor Sarcophagus to the tomb of Kiosk. They indeed find it, but it turns out that the tomb is just a cover for a band of smugglers. Tintin travels across the Red Sea to Arabia and from there to India, where he is hot on the heels of the gang's boss. Hergé has found his form. You can tell that from the story very clearly. It is no longer episodic, but follows a continuous arc to its climax. In addition, Hergé had built up an archive with pictures from all the areas where Tintin travels. The pictures therefore reflect the local colorate very well. And there's another talent of Hergé that we see in this story, recognizing the potential of characters. In the story, there's a total of 4 people who would accompany Tintin from now on his adventures. The first 2 are Thompson and Thompson, original Dupont et Dupont. They are called X33 and X33A in the first black and white version of the story. They are the policemen who want to arrest Tintin in the beginning of the story, but in the process they become valuable allies. Hergé recognized the humorous potential of the strange pair of twins, and he continued to expand it. Hergé created him after his father and his uncle, who were twins themselves and confused people by wearing the same outfit all the time. The next addition to Tintin's family is the eloquent Portuguese trader Oliveira de Figueira. Although Tintin tries to avoid it, Oliveira de Figueira is a person who can sell anybody anything, and even Tintin buys a lot of stuff he doesn't need. Oliveira will show up in further adventures whenever Tintin is in the Far East and in need. And finally, Hergé introduces a man whose role is not yet clear at the beginning, even though he himself is the boss of a movie company. The name is Roberto Rastapopoulos. It follows a well-known tradition of storytelling, the arch-nemesis. Sherlock Holmes had Professor Moriarty, and Tintin has Rastapopoulos. But their relationship was only at the beginning at this point. A few other things, however, have been added later in the color editing of the adventure. In this new version, the captain of the smuggler ship that picks up Tintin, Snowy and Professor Sarcophagus locked into sarcophagi is none other than Thompson, Alan Thompson, who will be Captain Haddock's treacherous first officer in a later adventure. The crab with the golden claws. So far so good, but there's a downright heavy anachronism in a scene which a sheikh is thrilled with Tintin's present and happily declares that he's reading every adventure, and then presents him a Tintin comic, Destination Moon. And Destination Moon was published 20 years after Cigars of the Pharaoh. So we see George Lucas is not the first one who corrected and adapted his work after a long time. The occasional reader who does not know the original edition will probably not noticing it, except that the cover of Destination Moon does not fit into the story. But the scene with the adding of Alan Thompson, for example, helps it to make the universe of Tintin more coherent. Other changes removed story elements that related very strongly to the 1930s, so this could become more of a timeless classic. And finally, the story finds an end point, and in contrast to the later double volumes that had a cliffhanger in the middle of the story and a reference to the sequel, this was not in every version of this comic. For example, the German version has no indication that there's a continuation in the Blue Lotus. It just says the end and that's it. Cigars of the Pharaoh is an exciting adventure which, as Rastapopoulos states in the story itself, is a pure film story. It has atmosphere and it captures the scenes very well. And Hergé was capable of further increases, as he will prove in the next volume.
The bloody English language, that's what we will. The English language will suffer by its glow.
In 1934 there was a meeting that would shape and change Hergé's work forever. He met the Chinese Chang Chong-chen, who taught him a lot about the culture of his homeland China and opened Hergé's eyes to the fact that there was not always the European point of view. In the adventures of Tintin so far, countries and incidents have been researched with more care, but the population mostly became a caricature, which was characterized by European resentment. Stereotypes. The communists were all evil, the Africans big children, and the Americans either capitalist exploiters or gangsters or cops who could not get control of the gangsters. They needed Tintin to help them. The encounter with Chang changed the view that Hergé had of China. And that's exactly what he wanted to show in the comics, because as the creator of Tintin's adventures, he felt responsible for the image readers get from each country. And he succeeded. The Blue Lotus is considered by many to be Tintin's best adventure. Tintin is still in India when he gets a visit from a guest from Shanghai. However, before the visitor can tell why he came, he is hit by an arrow soaked in rajaja juice. The poison makes him mad, but he can still deliver parts of the message, the words Mitsuhirato and Shanghai. So Tintin travels to China to contact Mitsuhirato, but he immediately gets attacked several times upon his arrival. Tintin comes into contact with an organization called Sons of the Dragon, whose members fight against opium. Head of the opium gang seems to be the before-mentioned Mitsuhirato. He cooperates with the corrupt police chief Dawson and Japanese officials. They make up a small incident and use it as an opportunity to bring Japanese troops to China. Against the background of these international complications, Tintin follows the trails of the true boss of the organization, somebody he's met before. At the time the story was published, a Belgian general commented that this is no more a children's story, it's the whole issue of the Asian East. And he's right and wrong at the same time. In fact, Hergé has picked up the problems between China and Japan as it was in the 1930s and woven it into his story. But that doesn't mean that it's unsuitable for children. If someone doesn't understand the political background of the story, he still will find an exotic adventure in which Tintin once again will stand up for the weak and defenseless. But readers who are old enough to already have developed political awareness will get it, and they are not required to know much about the background in the conflict between the two Asian states. Hergé brings the situation so sharply on the point that the platitudes of the Japanese politicians may only seem too familiar. If we have to send troops to China, which we would regret, it's merely to protect the Chinese people and to fulfill our mission as guardians of the order and civilization in the Far East. Does that ring a bell? Over 70 years later, politics still seem to work according to the same rules. Hergé had received advice from his new friend Chang Chongchen not only in terms of the political situation, but also in matters of culture. Therefore, not only the houses, pictures and statues are authentic, even the billboards and street signs are in the correct language. If you speak Mandarin, you can check it. Everyone else, including myself, will have to rely on others who say that they are. In order to honor Chang for his help and support, Hergé has also designed a character after the Chinese and included him into the comic. He didn't even bother to change the name. Tintin's Chinese companion in the adventure is also called Chang Chongchen. The Blue Lotus is one of the first masterpieces in the series in the adventures of Tintin. And despite his setting in the 1930s, it's still somehow timeless.
Success will be destroyed by our incorrectness. We enrich the English.
In 1935, the situation in Europe became increasingly unstable. However, that did not change Hergé's interest in international non-European politics. Inspired by the war between Bolivia and Paraguay, he creates a story that is set against the background of such a war over an area of oil fields. But he introduces another innovation in his series. He's inventing fictional states. From the Museum of Ethnology in Brussels, a small wooden statue, the fetish of the Arumbayas, a South American tribe, is mysteriously stolen. And the very next day, it is just as mysteriously brought back. Tintin realizes that something is wrong. The stolen fetish had a broken ear. The statue that is now in the museum is intact. After the murder of a sculptor, he's tracking down two criminals who are desperately looking for the real fetish. His chase leads him to the South American San Theodoros, a country shaken by revolutions and counter-revolutions. In the Blue Lotus, Hergé used the trick of fictional states only in one place, calling a guest in an opium bar the ambassador of Moldavia. In The Broken Ear he is using more fictional states. In that case they are San Theodorus and Nuevo Rico, and they should not be the last. Using fictional states he had more artistic freedom. The story of the Arumbaya fetish is at first a thriller. It's about theft, forgery and murder. The story behind it Tintin is almost accidentally a part of is the caricature of a petroleum war. Like in reality, in Tintin's world, the two countries are brought against each other by competing companies. On one side they are the British and on the other side they are the Americans. Once again, Hergé pushes the caricature to extremes when the war ends, because it turns out that the oil deposits that are suspected in the border region of the two countries simply do not exist. The South American revolutions and counter-revolutions are parodied to the extreme just as much. When Tintin is captured and stands in front of the executive committee, one revolution and two counter-revolutions take place, and depending on the ruler, Tintin is pardoned or sentenced to death. During the story, Tintin finally meets the new revolutionary leader, who will be a part of Tintin's stories further on, General Alcazar. Alcazar's arch-enemy Tapioca is mentioned, but he does not appear in person in the story. The parody is completed by the portrayal of the arms dealer Basil Bazarov, who delivers weapons to both hostile countries and thus is the only winner that might have been in this conflict. By the way, in one of Hergé's early drafts, the fact was never mentioned in the comic book series, Bazarov had a daughter named Peggy, and Peggy is married to General Alcazar in the story Tintin and the Picaros. In Tintin and the Picaros, the Arumbayas will appear again, and with them the scientist Ritual, who lives among them and desperately tries to teach them how to play golf. And he's more or less successful. And there's another character we meet again in Tintin and the Picaros that is introduced in this story. His name is Pablo. Since Tintin has a certain influence on Alcazar and is a pacifist, the two competing oil companies fear that Tintin could make Alcazar draw back from the war. So they pay Pablo to kill Tintin. But Pablo misses Tintin. But Tintin is not eager to throw Pablo into prison, and so Pablo will become later on a most valuable ally. In this scene where Pablo tries to shoot Tintin, we see a small mistake made by Hergé. This was due to the fact that Hergé has never seen a real banana tree in his life before. Have you spotted the mistake in this scene? Hergé had only seen photographs of bunches of bananas that were already cut from the tree. He had never seen bananas hang in their natural position, and due to that, he drew the banana bunch on the tree the wrong way round, as we can see here. The story is not quite as strong as its predecessor, the Blue Lotus. And above all, the scenes that play in the South American jungle sometimes seems as if Hergé had become a bit hectic, because all you see are the characters against a flat green background. But the story itself is funny, it has wit and ideas, all brought together in a criminal case. And again, one must say, war for oil? Doesn't that sound familiar?
Language with our beautiful accent, like in Deutschland. At least we all understand with an Egyptian.
In 1937 the situation in Europe became increasingly difficult. It was clear that Hitler was very serious about the announcement that the German Reich will be expanded by force and that it will take revenge for the disgrace of the Versailles Treaty. Meanwhile, inspired by an article about a German Nazi ally, Hergé designs Tintin's newest adventure, the fight against a money counterfeiting gang. During a walk, Tintin witnesses how a small plane has to make an emergency landing. When he tries to come to the aid of the crew, he is gunned down without warning. After Tintin hears that the plane crashed in England, he travels there to follow the strange events. He runs into the shady Dr. Müller, the helper of a money counterfeiting gang which has its headquarters on the Black Island, guarded by a monster. The article that inspired Hergé to this story had yet another component. The real gangsters, spurred on by the Nazis, wanted to damage the Russian economy by masses of false rubles. By moving the story to England, Hergé proved even foresight. In fact, after the war, large quantities of false pound notes were found in Nazi Germany. They were printed but never found their way to England. The key difference is that Tintin's adventure left out the political backstory this time. The Black Island is a pure crime story, in which Tintin has to solve some puzzles. The highlight is undoubtedly the appearance of the monster from the Black Island, which was inspired by the reports about the Loch Ness monster. But Hergé took a more realistic approach. The story was completely revised in 1965 at the instigation of the English publisher, since no less than 131 factual errors had been found in the representation of England or Scotland. And again, Hergé made the world of Tintin more coherent by several changes. For example, he changed the writing on a railway wagon from Johnny Walker whiskey to Loch Lomond whiskey. And in the end, he added the character Christopher Willowbeat Roop, a reporter, to a crowd. The reporter would have his first appearance in the later album called The Castafiore Emerald. Hergé did this twice before. In the adventure Tintin in the Congo, he added Thompson and Thompson, and in the Cigars of Pharaoh, he added Alan Thompson as captain of the smuggler's ship. The adventure shows that Hergé's story do not always need a political background, even though it was there in the creation of the Black Island. It is an exciting adventure that, as far as the monster of the Black Island is concerned, has an imaginative ending and in which the humor doesn't come up short, thanks to Thompson and Thompson.
The driver, I can talk a lot, he understands me, he understands you not.
On August the 4th, 1938, the first episode of Tintin in Moldavia was printed in Le Petit Vingtième. Once more, Hergé was inspired by actual political events, and he transferred them to a fictitious country, Moldavia. While walking in the park, Tintin finds a lost briefcase that belongs to sigillographer Professor Hector Alembic, a specialist for seals. Seals, like the wax things you stamp on a letter, not the animals. Well, Alembic wants to go to Moldavia and needs a secretary for the trip, and Tintin offers his help, but of course there's more to it. Tintin is warned several times not to accompany the professor, and he is even bombed. Tintin tracks down a plot to steal the sceptre from the Moldavian ruler Muskar XII. If he does not present the sceptre on the St. Vladimir Day, this would trigger an internal political crisis, and the neighbor state of Borduria is just waiting for such an opportunity to take over Moldavia. Although Hergé was inspired for the plot by Austria's annexation to the German Reich, as far as the planning goes, you could also say that he anticipated Germany's attack on Poland. In both cases, an enemy country wants to stage an incident in order to have an excuse to invade. The difference is that in reality there was no Tintin who thwarted the plans. Moldavia remained free. Poland was overrun. 3 weeks after the last episode of Tintin's adventures in Moldavia had been released, World War II had officially begun. With Moldavia, Hergé has come up with a very special country. This is demonstrated by the fact that he spends no less than 3 full pages on depicting a fictional travel guide, telling the country's history and pointing out the importance of the royal scepter. Hergé even goes as far as explaining individual words from the Moldavian language and their origin. So we learn that the country's capital, Klo, for example, has its name because it's a reconquered city. Klaho means conquest and O, city. Hergé depicts the country itself as a Balkan state. Templates for that he had collected from various countries, from Romania to Macedonia. At the same time, a new member of Tintin's family appears, whom we will meet several times further on, Bianca Castafiore. the Milanese nightingale, opera singer, a very loud opera singer. Her favorite piece of music comes from Gounod's opera Faust, and more than once she will burst out in the first lines of the Jewel song from the third act, 6th scene, number 14. However, her appearance in this story is rather short, since Tintin escapes from the vehicle he shares with her after she has demonstrated her singing skills to him. After this story was republished in one comic book, it was renamed from Tintin in Moldavia to King Ottokar's Sceptre. It's an imaginative adventure that, like The Broken Ear, has preserved its timelessness by referring to reality, but playing in a fictional place. Or playing in an alternate reality, as the curator of this museum would state.
With our hands, we are wonderful creative. What we don't understand is an English.
In 1939, World War II broke out. Hergé was drafted into the army, and even though he was far from home, he continued to produce a new Tintin adventure, page after page, entitled In the Land of Black Gold. In 1940, while Hergé was on shore leave in France, Belgium was conquered by the Germans. Tintin's regular magazine Le Petit Vingtième was discontinued. Hergé found a job at Le Soir and decided not to continue with In the Land of Black Gold for the time being. After all, the swastika now prevailed in France, and the villain of the story was Dr. Müller, known from the Black Island, a German. So Hergé left out any political allusion and turned to a topic he had worked on before: opium smuggling. Thompson & Thompson should actually take care of counterfeiters bringing up false coins, but the belongings found with a drowned sailor take the story in a completely different direction. A piece of paper from a can label with crab meat brings Tintin aboard the Caraboudjan without really knowing why. Here, Alan Thompson is the first officer, whom Tintin did not meet in the Cigars of Pharaoh. Alan smuggles opium in crab cans behind the back of his captain. Tintin discovers the smuggling, befriends the captain named Archibald Haddock, and flees with him from the ship. They end up in Morocco and are soon on the trail of the gang's head. First of all, it should be noted that in this story there is the almost historical encounter between Tintin and Captain Haddock, who will be accompanying the reporter's adventures from now on. In this respect, this story represents a milestone in Tintin's turbulent life. That the subject of the story is opium smuggling once more is not a flaw, and before mentioned, the later insertion of Alan Thompson in the stories The Cigars of Pharaoh makes the universe of Tintin a bit more coherent. But we haven't seen the malicious first officer of the Caraboudjan for the last time here. With Captain Archibald Haddock, Hergé has created a truly unique person. In the course of time, he has used no less than 200 different swear words, among which blistering barnacles is one of the most harmless. His tendency to alcohol is producing problems more than once. This is the reason that Alan can smuggle the opium behind the back of Captain Haddock, and it's later the reason why the Caraboudjan lifeboat goes up in flame, and again later, Tintin, Snowy and Haddock crash with their plane, due to Haddock's alcohol addiction. He will become better in later stories, but harder means are needed to free the captain from his suffering for Loch Lomond whiskey. All in all, The Crab with the Golden Claws is a well thought out crime thriller with plenty of situation comedy. By the way, parents don't have to worry about Haddock's swear words. Many of the words are not easy to understand. Or would someone know right away what a troglodyte is? Or a chlysopump? An anacoleuthens? An anthropophagus? A cataplasm? A coelacanth? An ectoplasmic byproduct, a hydrocarbon, an iconoclast? Well, I think you get the idea. October 1941. It was in between Tintin's stage adventures, and one day after the adventure The Crab with the Golden Claw found its conclusion. On this day, the first part of the newest story was published, and you could see the dark times during which it was produced. But this would mean the end of the world. Yes. After discovering a new star in the constellation of Ursa Minor on an extremely hot night and contacting observatory director Decimus Fossil, Tintin learns that the star is actually a meteor that will collide with Earth the next morning. But the end of the world does not happen. The meteor misses Earth, but a piece of it ends up in the Arctic Ocean. Since Fossil suspects that there's an element on it that does not exist on Earth, an expedition starts to recover the meteor. Time is short because a second expedition financed by bankers from Sao Rico is already underway. They want to recover the meteor because of the value of the new material. This story is a little darker than its predecessors, which is undoubtedly due to the circumstances under which it was produced, the war that was going on. Right at the beginning of the story, Hergé comes up with a bang. The end of the world is near. Other dark elements are the use of dreams that are at first not recognizable as such, the appearance of a dangerous, mentally ill person, and the arrival on the meteor itself with giant butterflies, giant spiders, and giant mushrooms. But Captain Haddock, who is in command of the expedition ship, has improved. He's far away from the alcoholic that set a lifeboat on fire in The Crab with the Golden Claws. He still has a tendency to drink, but when he is needed, he stands strong. An example is the episode when he stands on the bridge during a heavy storm and calls it just a small wind, and then saves his ship by preventing a collision with another. In this volume, Hergé wanted to criticize capitalism once more. On one side, the European expedition, which is only looking for the meteor purely for scientific reasons. On the other side, the expedition from Sao Rico, financed by banks that want to capitalize on the unknown element. The fact that the fictional country comes into play again is due to a change that was made later. In the original version, the competition came from the United States. The story is not so cheerful, with many dark nuances about a moral race, which, however, contains some important developments, especially regarding Captain Haddock. For me, this episode is somewhere in the middle of the field, while the next story is another highlight.
The language of Shakespeare you can smoke.
According to many experts, Hergé began a new creative period when he started working on The Secret of the Unicorn. Tintin had grown up. Hergé began the new period with two innovations that proved to be very successful. An adventure that was twice as long as the previous one, and the introduction of the last two important people into the repertoire of stories. At the flea market, Tintin finds the model of an old ship that he wants to give to Haddock. But it's not just him who's interested. He can only show it to the captain, then it is stolen. But Haddock realizes that the ship is the model of the unicorn, the ship of his ancestor Francis Haddock. Said Francis has hidden a treasure, and the unicorn models, of which there are 3, are the key. Tintin finds an old paper and slowly realizes what the thieves of his model were looking for when he is kidnapped by them. This story and its continuation has some surprises. The search for clues to a treasure is interwoven with a crime story in which some believe they know more than they really know. And in contrast to The Shooting Star, the story is a bit more lighthearted. While the continuation between The Cigars of Pharaoh and The Blue Lotus was a bit loose, and both albums could stand alone, the plot in The Secret of the Unicorn is not complete. There is a happy ending, but the treasure has not yet been found. The servant Nestor, who will later become Haddock's servant, is introduced as a new character. In this volume, he is still the butler of the antique dealer's bird, but without knowing about their criminal ambitions. Thompson and Thompson, who are on the trail of a pickpocket, provide the lighter note. This plot has only marginally to do with the secret of the unicorn, but is linked to the story in an interesting way. This book is one of the highlights of the series. Incidentally, it was also one of my first books from the Tintin adventures, and you can see it. The backside is fading, the binding is no longer fresh, and the pages have folds from reading a lot. So yes, this is my book, and I still like to read it from time to time, even today.
In the pipe, the language of Shakespeare.
There's not much to say about how Red Rackham's Treasure was written, because it was just the continuation of The Secret of the Unicorn, and Hergé concepted it as one story. But here we finally meet the last significant member of the Tintin ensemble. And he will play a vital part in further stories. After Tintin and Haddock discovered the secret of the unicorn in the last story, they now go on in search of the treasure. Francis Haddock left the position of the sunken ship on a parchment. In order to be able to find the ship's wreck, they need special diving equipment. And a certain Professor Cuthbert Calculus is willing to provide that special equipment. The plot comes to a surprising ending, just like the first part, even if there's no B-plot in this story. With Professor Cuthbert Calculus, Hergé has created another unique personality. He formed the likeness after the well-known scientist Auguste Picaros. Calculus is almost like the prototype of the absent-minded professor, an inventor who is occasionally overwhelmed with everyday things. Clearly seen in Tintin and the Picaros when he takes a bath and forgets to take off his bathrobe. Hergé also makes him a bit deaf, which makes for all kinds of strange situations. In this story, this works best when a reporter comes aboard the ship after it's returning from the expedition, and Haddock sends him to Calculus. You can see the poor man's desperation about the professor's answers, which have nothing to do with the questions he asked. In this album, the search from the first part continues as clever as it started. The story as a whole, both episodes together, is certainly one of the highlights of the series. My edition of Red Rackham's Treasure is just as shredded as The Secret of the Unicorn. In fact, I have no choice but to join Shakespeare, whom Calculus quotes with the closing words, "All's well that ends well."
Night. The language of Shakespeare.
December 1943, Hergé began working on a new, longer Tintin story, which however would take a total of 4 years to complete. This was due to World War II. Germany was fought back and the Nazi repression turned into its opposite. After the liberation there was only black or white. Either you had been a Nazi collaborator or a resistance fighter. And since Hergé had worked for the newspaper Le Soir, he had automatically become a collaborator. But he was lucky to have friends who knew his humanistic attitude and knew that he was not a friend of fascists. However, from September 1944 to September 1946, it was forbidden for Hergé to work. Thanks to his friend Raymond Leblanc, everything changed, and Tintin got his own weekly magazine, Tintin, and the story could go on. An expedition returns from South America after finding an Inca grave and bringing the finds to Europe, including a mummy. Then strange things start to happen. One member of the expedition after the other falls into a cataleptic sleep, which is interrupted every 24 hours at exactly the same time by a psychotic attack. Next to each victim, crystal fragments are found, which apparently come from a spherical ampule. Professor Hercules Tarragon seems to be the last member of the expedition who's not affected. He's an old friend of Professor Calculus, and so he, Tintin and Haddock go to visit him. He shows them the mummy of Raska Kapak and tells them of the curse that has apparently come over the members of the expedition. In this story, Hergé takes a trip into the world of the occult, which sometimes makes it very scary. For example, when Haddock, Tintin and Calculus dream the same dream that the mummy of Raska Kapak would come into their bedrooms. Nevertheless, the story also has its funny highlights, and with General Alcazar, who works under the name Ramon Zarate in the variety show, Tintin meets an old friend. The story gets a special twist when Calculus is kidnapped, apparently by the same people who are responsible for the condition of the 7 researchers. From that moment on, the occult takes a backseat and a crime story unfolds when it comes to persecuting the kidnappers. Volume 1 of the 2-part story ends when the trace leads to South America. Fun fact, one of the expedition members that appears in the story is Professor Paul Contenot, and he made his first appearance in the story The Shooting Star. The double-volume stories are undoubtedly among the best in the series. Unfortunately, after the 7 Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun, there will be only one more, Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon. Hergé's perfectionism was at its peak now, collecting information and images from everywhere. His main source of information, for example about foreign tribes like the Incas, was the National Geographic magazine. Critics of the story The Shooting Star had pointed out that Haddock's ship in that story would be neither sea nor ocean going. Such a criticism was something he wanted to avoid in future. His perfectionism helped improving the comics.
Spear will lose all its subtleties and
Prisoners of the Sun is the direct continuation of the story from the 7 Crystal Balls. It was written and conceived as one continuous story, so let's get right into the action. Calculus's kidnappers have arrived in Peru. The absent-minded professor apparently committed blasphemy in their eyes for putting on the bracelet of the mummy of Ras Karkapak. With the help of the Indian boy Zorino, Tintin and Haddock follow the kidnappers to the Andes, to the last hideout of the Incas, the Temple of the Sun. The occult that was a big part in the first volume of the story takes a backseat here for a long time again. Prisoners of the Sun is mainly an adventure story and tells how Haddock and Tintin get to the Temple of the Sun and what they experience there. The climax of the story that Hergé got from a tale about Christopher Columbus was not one he favored, and that was for 2 good reasons. First, the event that Tintin takes advantage of is taking far too long for a surprise effect. Second, what was the name of the place again where the brave adventurers are at the end of the story? Temple of the... Right. And one can actually assume that priests of such a temple know very well about this special event. Well, Hergé let the story end like this anyway, and it didn't do much harm. And again, we have some comical moments in the story. From Thompson and Thompson, but also from Captain Haddock. Hergé is reusing a trick he introduced in the 7 Crystal Balls. After Haddock fell down some stairs, he appeared to be looking at the reader grumpily as he wanted to say, "Hey, don't you laugh." In Prisoners of the Sun, this is driven even further. Haddock wants to demonstrate his fitness and jumps across a table. However, he does not quite make the jump and hits the table on the edge. The table flips over and a fruit bowl is catapulted up, and all the fruits are landing on Haddock's head. Here, Hergé breaks the famous 4th wall. The captain looks directly at the reader and asks, "Do you think that's funny?" The story had to be shortened a bit for the reworking as a comic book, but this is only noticeable if you look very closely, and it does not disturb the flow of the plot. Want to see an example? Well, when the two are separated briefly, Haddock finally meets a Tintin dressed as an Indian and does not recognize him on first sight. On page 12 of the comic book in the top row, Haddock addresses Tintin in the middle picture. "Tell me, my son, did you see a young white man with a small dog?" In the next panel, Tintin takes off his cap and says, "Yes, and I know him very well." Now if you look closely, you can see that Haddock and Tintin are standing on the street in the middle panel, And in the next panel, they are suddenly standing on a piece of lawn in front of the house that was previously in the background. Here, a sequence of panels was removed by Hergé, in which Haddock takes some chalk and draws a picture of Tintin on the house wall. The story is speeding up as a result, but unfortunately, the readers of the comic books will never see Haddock's drawing talent. Prisoners of the Sun is a worthy finale for an exciting story that plays into Hergé's preference for American natives.
Global disease.
In 1948, Hergé set about reworking and continuing a story that he had to interrupt in 1940 because of the German invasion, Land of Black Gold. By that time, he couldn't dare to portray a German as a villain under the Nazis, and now that was possible again. However, he had to adapt the story due to a few changed situations. The world is on the brink of a new war. At the same time, someone is sabotaging the gasoline reserves of the Western world. The gasoline is spoiled and causes engines to explode unexpectedly. While Thomson & Thompson suspect a company behind it that makes its money by towing and repairing cars, Tintin has another suspicion. He goes on a journey to the emirate of Sheikh Ben Kalish Etzab in search of the cause that leads him to Kemka. There he meets an old foe, Dr. Müller. And he gets to know the Sheikh himself and his unforgettable son, Abdallah. The story was originally written before The Crab with the Golden Claws and thus before Tintin met Haddock. And it was just not possible to simply integrate the captain into the plot of Land of Black Gold. The adventure begins with Tintin hiring as a radio operator on an oil tanker. It would have simply been impossible to include Haddock here, who is a captain after all. So Hergé used a trick. At the very beginning of the story, Tintin receives a call from Haddock. Because of the possible war, Haddock was drafted into the Navy and has to command a ship. The background of an imminent war confused me a bit as a young reader. Of course, the original story was about World War II, which had already started at the time and was only waiting for some allies to enter the conflict. The war in this story, however, remains a bit vague. The headlines that Tintin reads in the newspaper only speak of war, but not between what states. In the middle of the story, the reporter finally hears a radio report that the danger of war has been averted. At about the same point where Hergé had to interrupt the story for the first time in 1940 is also the point where the story finally gets an easier kick after being rather dark in the beginning. The original concept of the story was that the spoiled gasoline should stop the opponent's army. But now the background is, just like in the Arumbaya fetish, the battle of two opposing oil companies. Hergé deals with Haddock's part almost mischievously. Instead of making up a long-winded explanation for his absence and sudden appearance at the end of the story, he makes it very short. When Haddock is drafted into the Navy at the beginning, Hergé didn't even bother to name the captain's ship. He just says XY, the name must be kept secret. And the author turns his reappearance at the end into a running gag. Whenever Haddock wants to tell Tintin how it comes that he turns up so unexpectedly, he's interrupted by the events of the story. Overall, the story was no increase compared to the double volume 7 Crystal Balls and Prisoners of the Sun, but Hergé had reached a certain level. He should not fall under that level in future, although he came up with some ideas that some would call strange.
We take the English language and we fill it up with sounds you never heard.
The first man in the moon? Was that Neil Armstrong in July 1969? Not necessarily. In this world, in March 1953, the reporter Tintin landed on Earth's satellite with an expedition led by his friend Professor Calculus. Well, at least in this story, that's another masterpiece in Hergé's work. Professor Calculus sends a telegram and orders Tintin and Haddock to come to Sildavia, where he is currently staying. Big surprise! Sildavia has a nuclear research center where the scientist is working on inventing a nuclear engine. This engine shall be used to propel a rocket that will take people to the moon. And Calculus chose Tintin and Haddock as his companions. But from the very first moment, one thing is clear. A foreign power is very interested in the research results of Calculus's expedition. Finally, however, it happens. The journey into the unknown. Interestingly, the authors of the German novel series Perry Rhodan, launched in 1961, also came up with the idea of equipping the rocket of the first moon flight, which in their case took place in 1971, with a nuclear engine. But in terms of realism, Hergé was ahead, and I'm not talking about the extraterrestrials that Perry Rhodan found on the moon and Tintin didn't. What I mean, while Rhodan's rocket Stardust is permanently operated with nuclear power, Calculus's nameless moon rocket uses a conventional jet engine for takeoff and landing, to prevent contamination of landing and starting sites. In general, a lot of work was put into researching for the comic. Hergé had a model of the interior of the moon rocket built to ensure that it looked authentic on all panels. He and his employees consulted various specialists, for example about how did scientists imagine the lunar surface, how must the rocket be constructed, how the spacesuits. What means of transportation do you use on the moon? The comic book also includes one full page of a construction drawing of the moon rocket. And it's very detailed. The story about the moon flight is again woven into a mysterious crime story with a surprising resolution, but that comes at the end of the sequel. In the tradition of the cliffhanger, Volume 1 ends with the launch of the rocket and no one knows whether the astronauts are still alive. As a science fiction fan, I particularly like this double volume. I'm thrilled with how accurate it was handled. The double volumes are generally my favorite ones, but this is my personal highlight. And of course, as always, for the fun parts, there are Thompson and Thompson.
We will pronounce your consonants like as if the English would be a North Arabic Far.
Well, maybe I'll just go on with the story. After all, Explorers on the Moon is the direct continuation of Destination Moon. The rocket with Calculus, Tintin, Haddock, Snowy and Engineer Wolf is on its way to the moon. In the first excitement comes a big surprise right after the start. Thompson and Thompson, who can tell the difference between 1 o'clock AM and 1 o'clock PM, are also on board. The other surprise, however, only emerges while the expedition is already exploring the surface of the moon. A spy from a foreign power is also on board. His goal? To launch the moon rocket, leave the others on the moon and hand over their research results to that foreign power. The events in the second volume are just as credible as in the first one. Hergé is completely holding back the fantasy, and so the expedition participants do not come across some moon inhabitants or something, but instead they find a dark, hostile landscape. However, as the first real moonflight took place almost 20 years later, Hergé had to rely on scientific advisors. So he let his explorers find an ice field on the moon, a theory that was rejected later, but then again found to be true much later. And this is how science works. Other deviations from reality are due to the narrative, such as the completely transparent dome-shaped helmets. They were necessary so the reader can see from behind who's in the frame. For real astronauts, the helmet only has a visor at the front, and this visor is gold-plated to protect against rays. The story of the moon expedition is heading to a dramatic climax in this volume, one of the most dramatic in the whole series. Unfortunately, the story of the journey to the moon is the last double volume in this series. And that's for one good reason, a sad reason, because the composition of the frames and the well-thought plot does not show the circumstances under which it came about. Hergé was exhausted several times, so he founded a comic studio in which he had employees with clearly distributed tasks. His rhythm of work would also change, and he would go back to one-volume stories. In fact, there were no more two-volume stories until the end of the series.
And Central European, you may say, oh, the English has overcome.
In the mid-1950s, Hergé returned to the single-volume adventure, and he should stick with it. In the meantime, he had his own studio and began to make full use of its possibilities. So far, he first made the drawings in pencil and then transferred them to ink. Then they were colored. Now he could try out different techniques and perspectives, just like in the cinema. And the latest adventure should look like from the cinema. At Marlinspike Hall, glasses break for no apparent reason, and on a thunderstorm night, strange figures are strolling around the park. This comes to an abrupt end after Calculus left for a congress in Geneva. Tintin suspects a connection, and he and Haddock investigate in Calculus' laboratory. They find a huge apparatus that show that the professor was working on an experiment with ultrasound. They come across a Bordurian spy and realize that Calculus is in danger. They follow him to Geneva and get into a conflict between agents from Soldavia and Borduria. Well, before we start, two things that are not entirely consistent. First, it is not clear why Calculus is doing these experiments with ultrasound. During Destination Moon, he was proud to use nuclear power for a peaceful purpose. But what peaceful purpose should his ultrasound gun serve? And second, Soldavia is portrayed in this volume as rather villainous, although it was the exact opposite in the Moon adventure. But that's enough for the negative. The Calculus affair is a coherent Hitchcock-style agent story, in which Hergé again is mixing then current reality with fictional elements. The conflict between Soldavia and an apparently communist Borduria reflects the Cold War, under which influence the story was created. The studio's possibilities greatly fit with Hergé's sense of perfectionism, and for this story he even went so far as to look for locations in Geneva. The hotel where Calculus stays exists just like the villa that was the model for the Bordurian embassy. Even the spot where the car of Tintin and Haddock gets off-road and falls into Lake Geneva exists. You can go there and see those places. But if you plan to stay at Calculus's hotel, well, take the big bag with you. It's in Geneva's central city near some interesting places, but the rates for the rooms are really high. In this story, two new characters are introduced which will appear again in later books. The first one is Colonel Sponge, and yes, his name really comes from sponge, which is also a Brussels dialect word. He is the head of the Bordurian Secret Service. The other one is the intrusive insurance agent Joylon Wag. With him, Hergé created a character that probably every one of us knows. A person so annoying it hurts, whose mouth simply cannot stand still, and who is therefore naturally predestined for the job of an insurance salesman. Because, of course, one always wishes that he goes away as quickly as possible, and therefore one is tempted to buy anything he offers. Wag doesn't even accept the no as an answer when Haddock, annoyed, informs him that he's insured against everything. He just says, well, I'll make the papers ready, see you soon. Also introduced in the story is Katz the Butcher, although we mostly hear from him via telephone. This is due to the fact that the butchery has a very similar telephone number to that of Marlinspike Hall. So people get the number wrong and end up in Marlinspike Hall ordering, well, meat. And in reverse, if somebody from Marlinspike Halls try to dial a number in haste, they often end up accidentally calling the butchery. Cuz the butcher is someone who we will also see again in future stories. And Hergé introduces another element in the story that probably arose from his own situation. Captain Haddock is explaining in the opening sequence that he's having enough of all this adventure and all he wants is to stay at home and have peace. This resonates with the feeling that Hergé had himself. Sometimes he felt completely absorbed by his own creation and all he wanted was peace and quietness. In the following stories, Haddock will express the desire for rest and peace several times and then go into a new adventure anyway. This is brought to extremes in Tintin in Tibet, but we'll get to that. The Calculus Affair is an exciting story before the background of the East-West conflict, and it shows how well Hergé's adventures work when they are fictional but rooted in reality.
American and even the Jamaican, but the Jamaicans are few.
In 1956, Hergé began work on an adventure in which a whole lot of characters from previous stories would reappear. The story had a multi-layered plot dedicated to various current problems, one of them slave trading. At first, Tintin and Haddock accidentally meet General Alcazar after coming out of the cinema. Then, as a second surprise, Abdallah from Land of Black Gold also waits for them in Marlinspike. And soon they learn the reason for it. There was a coup d'etat in Abdallah's homeland and his father, the Emir, had to flee. His adversary, Sheikh Bab el-Air, has his planes from the same source from which Alcazar also wants to buy weapons in order to regain power in St. Theodorus. Tintin and Haddock travel to Kemet to visit the Emir, but their trip is sabotaged. Now on foot, they try to make their way to Bautista in order to travel further into the desert. Well, let's see. General Alcazar, Abdallah, Dawson, Oliveira de Figueira, Dr. Müller, Ben Kalish Etzap, Bianca Castafiore, Alan Thompson and Roberto Rastapopoulos. These are the characters from previous stories which meet in the Red Sea Sharks. In order of appearance. And not to mention General Tapioca and Sheikh Bab el-Air, but they are only mentioned, even though they play an important role. And our heroes meet the Estonian pilot Piotr Skut. He will reappear in another story. With the focus on slave trade, Hergé had found another topic where he could let Tintin stand up for the weak. And we see dramatic scenes, for example, when the pilgrims who were crammed into the cargo hold of the ship run onto Haddock because they think he is one of their tormentors. The plot that Muslim pilgrims on the way from Africa to Mecca, i.e. on one of the sacred acts that a Muslim should do at least once in his life according to the Quran, disappear and are sold as slaves, comes from a story that Hergé had been reading in a newspaper article. A similar practice was reported there, with which Arab customers were supplied with slaves. However, the code sentence "coke on board" that is used in the story is an invention by Hergé. However, it fits because it expresses the contempt of the people who see other human beings as trading goods. In addition to the dark mood, there are of course funny moments, for most of which Haddock is responsible. For example, when he's so tired that he falls asleep while talking to Oliveira de Figueira. Or when he meets Bianca Castafiore, who always turns his name around and he introduces himself as Rock'n'Roll. The end of the story and the fate of Rastapopoulos reminds the reader a bit of a James Bond movie, but You have to consider that the Red Sea Shark's story was written in 1958, and this was a time where the world had still to wait 4 years for the first James Bond movie. This is yet another exciting story, although the background story about multi-layers with arms smuggling and coup d'etat and also the slave trade can be somewhat confusing from time to time. But on the other hand, so is politics in real life.
We not native speakers are more than you. You are only 300 million. We beat you.
For the next adventure of Tintin, I have to report things are really getting tough. I have all these items from the last adventures, but they are of no use. Because it's not about a thing in the next adventure, it's about something more. Friendship and humanism. And here's where the Yeti comes into play. The abominable snowman, as they call him. Even he is portrayed in the story as a human being with compassion. But this adventure doesn't start with the Yeti himself. It starts with a color. The color white. 1958 was not a good year for Hergé. His marriage suffered from the work on Tintin's adventures. The artist had finally to admit that the love was gone, and he fell into a deep crisis. In nightmares he found himself in a world where everything was white. White like a blank sheet of paper. He consulted a psychologist who told him blatantly that he would never ever finish a story again, and that it would be better to give up drawing comics entirely. However, Hergé did what modern psychoanalysis calls confrontation therapy. He worked everything, the white fields, his crisis, and the advice to simply give up, into a new Tintin adventure. Tintin, Haddock and Calculus are vacationing in the Alps when a letter from Chang Chong Chen arrives. Tintin met Chang Chong Chen in the Blue Lotus and he's very happy to hear from him again. Chang writes that he's coming to London, but he wants to visit Tintin first. Unfortunately, his plane crashes in the mountains of Tibet. According to newspaper reports, no passenger survived, but due to a dream that Tintin has, he's convinced that Chang is still alive. Against all odds and the ever-complaining Captain Haddock, Tintin heads to the crash site in the mountains to save his friend. Tintin in Tibet shows a new side of Tintin's adventures, because there's no villain, no major threat in this story. It's about values like friendships and how far you would go for a friendship. Tintin is ready to go very far. Again and again he's ready to go alone, but every time Haddock, contrary to his announcements, is coming with him. And here it's also about friendship, because actually Haddock has nothing to do with Chang and is convinced that he died in the crash. But he still comes on this ridiculous search. Hergé managed to capture the local culture in an outstanding manner. For example, the traditional greeting, the Tibetan monastery, and last but not least, the snow-covered range of the mountains, that are ultimately nothing more than a reflection of the large white fields that the artist had encountered in his nightmares. By processing a personal situation with a lot of emotion, Hergé has created a strong and authentic story. We can even see a very rare moment. After receiving the news that Chang's plane has crashed and he is presumed to be dead, Tintin is in tears. All these details make this story stand out like the peak of the Himalayas. And throughout the story, the question is not so much how does the hero get out of this dangerous situation, it's more about what does the hero do next? What's next? And as a reader, you're fully engaged every time Tintin discovers a new clue to the mystery of what happened to Chang. Of course, there are also funny moments, like the first time Tintin has a dream about Chang and he cries his name out loud, causing chaos to the people around him. In this story we also see Hergé's fascination about Tibetan Buddhism. Unfortunately, things were not going well for the Buddhists at this time. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetans, gave in to the pressure from the Chinese government that had occupied the country in 1949 and fled to India in March 1959. Tintin in Tibet was completed in November of the same year. At this time, Hergé's personal situation had changed for the better.
Ja, look in Wikipedia. Actually billions of pupils in school.
The stories of Tintin so far were adventures in the classic sense. The hero goes out into the world and finds a situation that he has to clean up. For the newest story, however, Hergé broke with this principle. The adventure should come to Marlinspike Hall. A big surprise! Bianca Castafiore, the Milanese nightingale, sends a telegram telling that she will come to visit Marlinspike Hall. When Haddock rushes to leave before she arrives, he falls over a broken step and sprains his ankle. Therefore, escaping is out of the question, and he has to endure the arrival of the Castafiore, her maid Irma, her personal pianist Igor Wagner, with all the consequences. A talkative parrot, a television broadcast from Marlinspike Hall, and journalists sniffing around looking for a story. But then, the most valuable piece of the Castafiore's jewelry disappears. An emerald that has been given to her by the Maharaja of Gopal. If you wanted to write a Tintin theatre play, the Castafiore Emerald would be the ideal template. The setting is and remains Marlinspike throughout the story, and that's enough. There are all sorts of funny situations about the chaos that is triggered through the arrival of the Italian nightingale, until the emerald disappears. Then it becomes some sort of a crime story. Hergé is obviously having fun making up red herrings and also playing with resentments. For example, when the Thompsons suspect that a group of Romani who camp near Marlinspike are responsible for the theft of the emerald without having any kind of evidence. The story itself goes from trace to trace until Tintin comes up with the right idea. But if you look very closely at the very first panel of the adventure, you might find out that the solution is hidden there. For the story, a new side character was created. The local stonemason Arthur Bolt. He was supposed to fix the broken step, but always apologized because he had no time. Interestingly, he is a member of the Harmonia Marlinspike, local band who plays a song for Captain Haddock and the Castafiore. And if you look closely, you will discover that the leader of the band is none other than Katz the Butcher. Arthur Bolt is a stand-in for craftsmen who never keep their appointments because reasons. And yes, that is a cliché. This adventure is very different from the previous due to the limited story and the limited place. And nothing happens that can be compared to the drama of previous adventures. Nobody is threatened, nobody is in danger, and the villain behind the whole thing is not Tintin's arch enemy Rastapopoulos. And therefore it may be that the Castafiore Emerald is not so well received by some fans, because the well-known paths are consistently left here. For me personally, it was a refreshing change.
Schools with lousy teachers learn the wrong routes. They are working day and night at
The Wikipedia describes a volcano as a rupture in the crust of a planetary mass object, such as Earth, that allows hot lava, volcanic ash and gases to escape from a magma chamber below the surface. A volcano plays a significant role in the next adventure of Tintin. Fans have been waiting long for it. It took 4 years before Hergé started a new Tintin adventure after the Castafiore Emerald. and its resolution should be very controversial among the fans of the series. On the way to a space exploration conference in Sydney, Tintin, Haddock and Professor Calculus run into their old friend Scut. He's the private pilot of the multi-millionaire Laszlo Carreras, who spontaneously invites them to come along to Sydney in his private supersonic aircraft. They follow the invitation, but this way they get caught in the middle of a kidnapping. The private jet is forcibly diverted to a volcanic island in the Pacific. There the plane has a rough landing, but right after it the head of the kidnapping is revealed, Rastapopoulos. He wants a fair share of Carreras' millions. To find out the number of a secret Swiss bank account, Rastapopoulos uses a serum developed by the dodgy Dr. Krolspell, which is supposed to get Carreras to answer the questions truthfully. Tintin and the other prisoners realize that once Carreras has told the bank account number, all of them will be killed. They escape their guards, but on the run Tintin starts hearing voices that lead him to a cave. There they meet an unusual guest. Hergé was quite interested in the considerations of whether there is extraterrestrial life, so much so that he broke one of the principles of his series, keeping the stories grounded in realism. The appearance of a flying saucer was the reason why many fans criticized this adventure. Even if the extraterrestrials themselves are not shown, the story as a whole goes very far into speculation. Regardless of this aspect, the appearance of a non-earthly power looks a bit like a deus ex machina. Our heroes can only escape from the island and from Rastapopoulos, his henchman Alan Thompson and their helpers, with the help from above. Unfortunately, this makes the story a bit weak, although it starts very promising. By the way, the helpers of Rastapopoulos are from Sondonesia, another fictive country that Hergé introduces in this story. Back to the story itself. If you ignore the weakness, the adventure has also some great highlights. Like when Alan is reminded of Rastapopoulos when he encounters a proboscis monkey, or when the truth serum that Krolspell injects to Carreras means that the millionaire literally tells the absolute truth. He begins to confess all the crimes of his life, starting from his childhood. Similar to the movie Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, you either have to accept the presence of aliens or look over them and enjoy the rest. And then you have a nice entertaining adventure with many humorous highlights. By the way, the cover of the comic book was the basis for a bitter parody after the plane crash at Amsterdam airport in 1992. It was a poster that campaigners against the airport designed. The title reads Vlucht LA 1862. That is, Flight LY 1862. The stone statues on the left and right have been replaced by smoking debris, and instead of Tintin and his companions, in the middle there are firefighters who are about to put out the fire of the crash. The story behind this. On October 2nd, 1992, a Boeing 747, the flight LY1862, crashed into two Amsterdam skyscrapers shortly after taking off from Schiphol Airport. After the disaster, the discussion flared up again whether airports should be so close to residential areas. And it was neither the first nor the last time that the Tintin stories have been the basis for such a parody. And especially Tintin's flawlessness is targeted again and again by parody and satire.
Localization of the English, of its mutilation. This is
The intervals between the individual Tintin stories had become longer and longer over time. Up to Tintin in Tibet, the adventures always came one after the other, with the exception of some breaks, for example during the war. Then it took 2 years for the Castafiore Emeralds, then 5 years for Flight 714 to Sydney, and with this story Hergé celebrated his 60th birthday. But after that, 9 years would pass before another story was finished in the mid-1970s. Captain Haddock finds out that he no longer likes his beloved Loch Lomond whiskey, but that is only his smallest concern. After General Alcazar defeated his eternal adversary Tapioca in the Red Sea Sharks and took over power in the South American country of San Theodoros, the tides have now turned again. Tapioca is in power and Alcazar has fled into the jungle. When Bianca Castafiore, accompanied by the Thompsons, comes on tour to San Theodoros, secret services discover allegedly secret papers in which she is accused of conspiracy. Haddock and Tintin are also said to be involved in the conspiracy, as the Castafiore had good contact with the two. When Haddock contradicts this in a very colored language, Tapioca invites him, Tintin and Calculus to San Theodoros to clarify the matter. Tintin senses a trap, but something has to be done. The Castafiore, her maid and her pianist are sentenced to long prison terms. The Thompsons even get the death penalty. Tintin's old friend General Alcazar may bring help, together with his soldiers, the Picaros. What impressed me most about the story as a child was a trick Hergé used to show the situation in South America in extremes. When Haddock and Calculus arrive in San Theodoros, you can see their plane heading for the airport over a slum, a favela, as we know it from many television reports. Two policemen walk past the people living in deep poverty, and a sign with the slogan "Viva Tapioca" adorns the huts. The last picture of the comic book shows the plane with Tintin, Haddock and Calculus, which is just taking off and bringing the three back home. The scene in the foreground is almost identical: the slum, the poor people and the two police officers who wear different uniforms and, instead of mustaches, now full beards, and a sign with the slogan "Viva Alcazar" is seen. That got me thinking back then, and that's exactly what the scene is supposed to do, regardless of the name of the ruler. Nothing has changed in the poor people's situation. But a lot has changed in the characters. In this story, it is Tintin who initially refuses to go on an adventure. Haddock can no longer drink alcohol, which he owes to an invention by Professor Calculus, which will be proved to be very useful in the course of the story. And Calculus apparently had lost a few scruples about testing his invention on Haddock without telling him anything. When the comic book was released, Tintin was on adventures for almost 50 years. And you can see a certain weariness in the story. However, this story is also the one with the most strongly expressed social criticism. This includes not only the before-mentioned scene with the slums, but also the drunken Arumbayas, the merciless state power of a General Tapioca, or the background to the conflict between Tapioca and Alcazar, which Tintin explains at the beginning. There are two foreign company groups that use the respective side for their own interests. But you can also see it on a small scale, because when Tintin arrived at Marlinspike Hall on the first page on his moped, he is wearing a helmet with a sticker from the peace movement. Due to the special circumstances, this adventure unfortunately became the last complete one, and it is also a worthy conclusion, although Hergé apparently only intended the conclusion to be the next story. Tintin and the Picaros is a real good adventure with a strong social background.
English is the second language, and therefore it will turn out the worst.
8 years after Tintin and the Picaros, Hergé set out to draw a new adventure for Tintin, which gives the impression that it had been planned as the culmination of a long series. We will never know whether this is the case. Hergé died on March 3rd, 1983, before he could complete it. While fleeing from the Castafiore, Haddock stumbles upon an art gallery. There he is approached by an art expert who wants to discuss something with Tintin and makes an appointment. However, the expert does not show up for the appointment. He was killed in a car accident. After being the second expert to have died a sudden and strange death, Tintin investigates and uncovers the magician Engadin Akas, who bears a striking resemblance to someone Tintin knows. The trail leads him and Haddock to Ischia, where the artist Ramo Nash designed his Alph-Art. a criticism of this album is not possible. There are about 40 pages of the entire story, 4 of which are penciled out so you could make them into the final version. The rest only exists in the form of sometimes very rough sketches, which only show the structure, the image composition and, in parts, the plot of the story. In addition, the story breaks off at one of the most exciting points. Following the notes, Hergé wasn't even sure how to solve the situation there, and if he already had an idea, he took this idea with him to the grave. Hergé had set up a last will that no one should continue the story of Tintin after his death, which is contrary to many other series from the Franco-Belgian region, such as Spirou or Colonel Clifford. Hergé's heirs decided to respect this wish, although Bob de Moor, Hergé's assistant, would have liked to finish the story. It was left as it was and released that way, along with a few pages of notes with ideas. These notes show that Tintin and Alph-Art would have become a real panopticon of Tintin characters, because the following were planned to show up. Of course, the Castafiore, her maid Irma, and Igor Wagner, Joylon Wack, the annoying insurance salesman, Katz the butcher, the Thompsons, Emir Ben Kalish Etzap, Gibbons from the Blue Lotus, Dawson, also the Blue Lotus, and the Red Sea Sharks, Chiclet from the Broken Ear and Tintin and the Picaros, Madame Jamila and her husband from the 7 Crystal Balls, Ivan Sakharin and the Brothers Bird from The Secret of the Unicorn, and Laszlo Karidas and Mik Estanidov from Flight 714 to Sydney. Other notes even mention Dr. Krollspell from Flight 714 to Sydney, as well as the countries of Moldavia, Borduria and Sondonesia. And for the first time, Tintin also meets a woman who stands out among the other female characters. But whether Hergé would have dared to actually bring in something like romance or even planned a definitive happy ending for his eternal bachelor, that cannot be concluded from the records. Here too, the artist took the secret with him to the grave. And silent like a grave is the motto of the Thompsons, so we leave it here. Tintin and Alph-Art is definitely only something for absolute Tintin fans or comic enthusiasts who are interested in Hergé's way of working, which you can understand very nicely from the sketches, from almost finished scenes at the beginning to rough line drawings and just accumulated ideas at the end. On the one hand, it is a pity that Hergé decreed that no one should continue his work after his death. On the other hand, it is questionable if Tintin, drawn by another artist, would have been the same. Anyway, it wouldn't have taken away the character's popularity. So this was my report, and now the end of the year is near. And once more!
The language of Shakespeare you can smoke in the pipe. The language of Shakespeare, good night. The language of Shakespeare will lose all its beauty. Come on, fellow barbarians, sing along with me. The language of Shakespeare you can smoke in the pipe. The language of Shakespeare, good night. The language of Shakespeare will lose all its beauty. Let's talk all together in English made in Germany, Italy, Hungary, Turkey, Haiti, Djibouti, Fiji, Malawi, from Brazzaville to Berlin. The winner